I'm good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, February 16th, 2021. And a special welcome to our guests from across the state line in Pullman and around the state from Washington State University. Even though the University of Idaho is officially closed today, the Renfrew Colloquium goes on. Not even snow, cold, wind, or inclement weather will stop the pursuit of knowledge and the sharing of interdisciplinary ideas. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Next week in this space, we are already into the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival, which this year will be entirely virtual. And I hope you will join us on Tuesday, the 23rd, a week from today, where Josh Skinner, Vern Seelert, and Vanessa Seelert from the Lionel Hampton School of Music will take us behind the curtain of a virtual jazz festival and explain what goes into producing that three-day event entirely through teleconferencing and Zoom and other remote technology, since we're not able to gather in person this year, and how we keep up that spirit of Lionel Hampton in the 21st century. Today's guest is not a stranger to many of us, well known in the community, and we're delighted to have him presenting for the first time to the Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Professor Joe Campbell studies free will, moral responsibility, David Hume, and skepticism. He was recently awarded a WSU Humanities Fellowship for a project on punishment and prison reform. He's currently editing his 9th book, The Black Whale Companion to Free Will, which ties right in with today's topic, Apology for Free Will, a defense in light of findings in neuroscience, psychology, and the social sciences. So please welcome Professor Joe Campbell.
Thank you. And thank you, Kenton and Dan and other people who organize this. I'm very proud to be part of this. I don't think I knew Professor Renfrew, but I've heard a lot about him, and I'm all for interdisciplinary studies and education in the academy. And we need it today more than ever, I think. And hopefully toward that end, I'm going to teach you today a little bit of something about free will. I just have to get up my screen, unfortunately. Let me try one more time. I've not mastered the screen sharing options. Sorry. Here we go. So I am going to try to dissuade your worries about free will today and give you a little bit of hope. Here's a outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to provide a little bit of context, some philosophical, historical background. I think of free will and determinism as a modal problem. Free will is a kind of possibility. Determinism is a kind of necessity. How does the one fit with the other? And so we're going to do a little bit of modal logic, just a little bit, but little modal logic. We're going to learn about the logic of free will. What's the modal logic behind that? And then I'm going to see what you think, see if you have any other questions. And so just for the context, I think of free will as just one of a spectrum of different philosophical problems. And I think actually, personally, they're related in the sense that some of the arguments have similar formal structures. But it's interesting to me also that people have different attitudes about these problems. So sometimes the problems strike them as worrisome, and sometimes they don't. They laugh them off. And sometimes we have formal solutions to what were once paradoxes. So Zeno's paradoxes of motion, for instance, the original formulation of those paradoxes, that was formally solved by the invention of, I think, non-standard analysis. And then there were standard analysis solutions too. So there were developments in, formal developments in the history of mathematics related to attempts to solving the problem. And then with other problems, we have a kind of common sense dismissal, the external world, why worry about that? Sometimes with philosophical problems, there's a spiritual acceptance. So Buddhists take what is a problem of the existence of the self and turn it into a solution to the problem of suffering. Because if there's no self, there's no suffering. And then sometimes we just have an existential crisis, no free will, no meaning, whatever. So there are a variety of different things. Now, I'm not going to talk too much now, but one part of it is, I think we have this attitude that the problems on the top are amenable to formal solution and the ones at the bottom are not, where we're just left with, spiritual acceptance or existential crisis, and that's all we could do. There's nothing that logic or formal methods could do to help us solve the problem. It's ineffable in a certain sense. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to provide a formal solution to the problem of free will and determinism by putting it in the context of other arguments about modality and teaching you a little bit about modal logic. But that's just one of many possible solutions. And so in the end, we'll talk about what you think and what you think about free will, whether you think we have it, given the challenges that we're going to face in this discussion. Now, my concern with this is almost purely on a logical level. And it really relates to just this simple passage about this argument from antiquity, from the old Stoa, who were maybe 300, 100 BCE, after Aristotle in the Hellenistic period of ancient Greece. Well, they call it ancient Greece, but if you look on the map, Greece is sort of in the middle, but all the dots are these philosophers from this period. So it isn't just Greece, there's lots of surrounding areas. And in fact, the logicians I'm interested in, a lot of them are from Turkey. They're all the way like off on the right there. And some of them are from Egypt. They're not even actually on this map, I don't think. So in any event, this argument tries to boil down puzzles about necessity and possibility to this simple trilemma, where a trilemma is a set of propositions, claims that can't all be true, that are inconsistent as a set, okay? So one claim is accidental necessity, and these concepts are going to be with us, and we'll talk about them in more detail. But accidental necessity for now, just think of as the necessity of the past. You can't do anything about what happened yesterday. I can't change the fact that I'm wearing this shirt for this presentation now. I can't do anything about that. And then we have a certain principle about how modalities, possibilities, necessities are related together. So only the possible can follow from the possible. That's closure. The impossible can't follow. The necessary follows from the necessary, not from the possible. And we'll talk more about this as we go on. And then there's contingency, that there are some propositions, claims about the world that are true, but are possible, could be true, but neither will be true or are true. So the one I always think of is Joe gets a nose ring, which is possible I could get a nose ring. Chances are pretty remote at this time in my life. Not that I have anything against it. I just don't see myself doing that. It's possible, not going to happen. It's a contingency in that sense. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is a historical fact. This ruling argument, this is all we have of the ruling argument left. This right here, this information, that we have these three propositions that are alleged to be inconsistent. Okay? Why? We don't know. We're going to try to redevelop the argument, but the text has been lost, which is kind of a mystery. Why is it lost? Well, maybe we could explore that a little bit later. But what we're interested in is the relationship of this above argument. So we get from accidental necessity and closure to the denial of inconsistency, because they can't all be true, to this argument, the consequence argument that we're going to look at a little bit more detail. So roughly, here's what's going on in this argument. You've got the past. There's nothing we could do about it. It's accidentally necessary. Well, if determinism is true, the past is connected to the future via the laws of nature. There's an inextricable connection that we can't do anything about either. Then it seems that we can't do anything about the future, about anything that follows from the past and the laws, given the thesis of determinism. Now, if you notice, though, there are four things doing the work here. You got the accidental necessity, the determinism, the closure, and then the denial of necessity. Above here, you have everything but determinism. So it opens up the question of what's the logical work of determinism? What's the logical work of the quote unquote evidence that we have no free will from neuroscience, from social science? How does it fit in if this is the structure of the argument? I have my doubts, but they're just doubts, right? So we're going to think about free will as a kind of possibility, right? So a person has free will. I think everybody can agree with this statement, if and only if some of her actions are up to her. Some philosophers, like myself, think what that means in order for an action to be up to a person is that she could have done otherwise. She could have performed another choice. You have alternative possibilities, right? You could go left in the road, you could go right in the road. It's up to you. Now, not everybody agrees with that, but we could talk about that later. Just to keep things simple, let's just make that assumption for now. And then we have another assumption that it isn't just the fact that we have choices that gives us free will, but the way that we have choices, the fact that we deliberate, we make choices based on conscious decision-making procedures. We have plans, we try to carry them out. That's part of the story that we tell about free will. So free will requires some kind of consciousness of our reasons for acting, okay? So free will kind of possibility, determinism kind of necessity. Only the difference here is there are lots of different kinds of determinisms. There are ways in which we might think that the events or the propositions, claims about the world are fixed and sort of beyond our control. So, and they come in degrees, right? So they come in degrees of heat. By heat, I mean more problematic for free will. Cold, less problematic for free will. And then, you know, the indigo in between is kind of problematic for some people, not so problematic for others. So there's this kind of, difference in how these determinisms might impact free will that philosophers have, attitudes that philosophers tend to have. So an innocuous form of determinism we'll just call actuality determinism. Whatever will be, right? So every proposition, every claim about the world is either true or false. They can't be both true or false, right? And they don't change their truth values. If it's true, then it's true for all time. It doesn't become true at a certain time. Now, this is a kind of fixity of the world, but notice there's no modality here, no like obvious modality. No talk about possibility, no talk about necessity, just talk about truth. So a lot of people are suspicious that you could turn actuality necessity into the kind of, or actuality determinism into the kind of necessity that might rob you of free will. In between is divine foreknowledge, which I knew some people would come here. How can knowledge influence? But some people think the knowledge of God, a special case, might influence. Causal determinism, a lot of people think is problematic. Most philosophers, I think that it's problematic. And I think that most of the folk, most of you, most common people, most students, most everyday people that you meet think that causal determinism causes a problem for free will. And we could see why immediately, because I'm defining causal determinism as the view that there is only one physically possible future. But we just saw that free will required alternative possibilities. at least two physically, well, not physically possible, say, but possible futures, right? And so it seems like there's a conflict, a potential conflict here between causal determinism and the requirements of free will that we suggested before. But let's be clear, all we mean by physical possibility, and all anybody means by physical possibility, the kind that pertains to causal determinism, is it's just the extension of what we'll call the deep past, where the deep past is just the past together with the laws of nature. Because remember, as we'll see, the real key to determinism is, you could take like any description about the world, maybe not one about the instance the world started, maybe like 2 seconds after the world started. So suppose that this is a proposition about all the events of the world at time t2, 2 seconds after the world. Determinism tells you you can get from that proposition via the laws of nature to any other proposition that's true. Any single one, doesn't really matter. So, but that is a special kind of necessity that we'll explore a little bit later. Now, free will denialism is the view that we don't have free will. It's very popular now. It's popular among the folk, and it's popular also among philosophers. And there are good reasons for its popularity. There are interesting experiments, who thought that you could do experiments and it might shed some light on philosophical problems? But in fact, that's the way that we are today. In fact, there are experiments and they do shed light on our understanding of free will and pose certain challenges, as we'll see, to the concept of free will. And then there's also philosophical considerations that are connected to it. I just mentioned Dirk Pereboom. He's one person. Whether he's a free will denialist or not actually isn't so clear. It depends on how you define free will. I'm taking a little bit of a chance in saying that given the way that we're defining it, he would classify himself as a free will denialist. But he certainly thinks that, because he doesn't think that we have the ability to do otherwise. And he doesn't think that we have it, whether determinism is true or false. But he thinks that we have a kind of control. We could deliberate, there's ethics, you can have a meaningful life, and we could incarcerate people for our own protection. So you don't lose everything with Dirk's view. Interesting form of denying at least certain forms of free will. Like I said, there are other kinds of freedom that Dirk accepts as well. Now let's look at one challenge from neuroscience. And we could talk about the details. I just want to go over this somewhat quickly for now, but I'm looking, we have a little bit of time. I don't have to be that quick, but so the setup here is you have this participant who's asked to perform some simple action like the flexing of a wrist at some time or extending your finger, something like that. Some simple action at an undisclosed time, a time of their choice, within a certain framework, right? The framework of the test. And then while they're doing this, they're asked to observe this thing called a limit clock. It's just a dot like spinning around on a dial, and they have to say where it is when they have the conscious awareness of flexing their wrist, say, or pointing their finger, whatever the task is that they want to do. Meanwhile, they're hooked up to various different devices, EEGs, fMRIs, depth electrode studies, get the measurements directly on the surface of the brain, right? People who, for one reason or another, have parts of their skulls that are removable. You could perform studies like this on that. And then the closer you get to the brain, the higher this correlation I'm going to point out happens. And what the correlation is, there's a certain kind of brain activity before the W time, the time of you're consciously aware of making the choice. We'll call it a readiness potential, okay, an RP. So the idea is the RP occurs before the time of conscious choice, which is before the time of action, but the RP is highly correlated with the action. In some studies, as high as 80%. And the thought is that as we get better, we've only been doing this for a while, the percentage might get higher. So it seems like the RP is doing some causal work. So how is there room for consciousness to play an active role in your choices? That's the worry. And then in social science and psychology, a bunch of studies, we could talk about the details of some of these. I'm just going to talk mostly about, these aren't real studies, these are just your own observations. You're driving down the street, riding down the street, all of a sudden you see one of these stop signs and it flashes 25 miles an hour or whatever, or 35, say, in a 25-mile zone. You start to slow down. I bet for most people, when you see the light, you slow down just automatically. You don't really think about it. No role for sort of consciousness to play in the behavior. The behavior seems to be set by the circumstances you're in. Likewise, you want to make more tips, put little googly eyes on the tip jar. If people see the jar staring back at them, they have a tendency to tip more. It's been proven. They've done studies on this. So the situation seems to sort of dictate our behavior, not leaving room for conscious control. They have other experiments where if you find a dime in a toll booth, you're more likely to help people. Bystander experiments, if there are 5 witnesses, you're less likely to come to the aid of somebody than if there are no witnesses at all. And then we know about like the Milgram experiments, Stanford prison experiments, which are experiments that try to show how obedience and certain kinds of power structures might influence people to behave in ways that they might not normally behave. These studies, both of those studies, the last 2, Milgram experiments and Stanford prison experiments, had Nazi Germany in mind. How could people do such horrible things? Well, maybe there were situational circumstances that led to that behavior, and it wasn't a conscious choice that the people made, which would be relevant to find out. So to sort of summarize, there's this thesis of situationism. The actions are functions of situations, and so they're not up to us. The situation, speed signs, finding a dime, dictates the action. Deliberative choice, even character, have no role to play. Some situationists deny that we have character at all. There are no character traits at all. Like the neuroscience experiments, this suggests that there are causal factors that bypass conscious self-control and violate the consciousness and free will principle, one of the necessary conditions for free will that we established. So nobody has free will. Okay, now here's me. I'm the Big Lebowski. Now the Big Lebowski, see, he's a detective. This is a neo-noir film. He's trying to solve a mystery, and this is me. I'm trying to solve this mystery. I'm thinking of the logic of the argument. I'm thinking of the role that these various different experiments could possibly play in the logic of this argument. If you think of this, the argument we started out with, that tries to show that free will is incompatible with determinism. You start with the thesis of determinism. There's an inextricable connection between the past and the future, and we can't do anything about it. You throw in the fact that we can't do anything about the past, and then it seems like we can't do anything about the future. And then these other experiments, it's a similar sort of thing. We just don't have any control, the right kind of control over the readiness potential, because consciousness is not active yet. We don't have the right kind of control over a situation. If that's influencing our actions, then it takes away our freedom. That's the suggestion. That's the idea. So my contention is that it comes back to this argument. If we could show that this argument is faulty, and if we could see actually the role that these experiments are playing in the arguments, then maybe we won't be so worried about whether or not we have free will. So I'm going to teach you 4 modal logic lessons, and then we're going to learn some, apply them to the logic of free will. So modal logic lesson number 1, modalities are pervasive. If you're somebody like me who does modal logic for a living, you see them all the time. You can't talk to people without, you talk to people who deny free will. They talk about things they do all the time or could do. I wish I would have, all this other stuff like this. It's hard, right? There's logical, mathematical, practical, technological, legal, psychological, biological, medical, moral necessity, possible, contingent, impossible, obligatory, permissible, eternal, potentials, abilities, dispositions. These are all modal concepts. And ultimately, that's why it's called the ruling argument. It's supposed to sort of establish, and was thought to establish until they got rid of all the books, the basic laws of modality. And there were hundreds of these books, by the way, or not, there were hundreds of books written by old Stoa logicians that are no longer available to us. We could go into that. They actually were confused about Stoic logic until the 1960s. Honestly, they thought it was an Aristotelian categorical logic when it was a propositional logic. Don't get me started. We can talk about this a little bit later. Anyway, second lesson, actuality is a modality. So it's not just possible and necessary. Truth and falsity are modalities, just like possibility and necessity. And they're connected to the other modalities. Something's necessary, it's true. If it's impossible, it's false. If it's true, it's possible. And then the big one that we're going to talk about is that some possibilities must be realizable, at least within the context of debates about free will and moral responsibility. So there's a sense in which, I can fly, right? I can imagine flying. You can make a cartoon, Joe flies, right? It's possible in this kind of very abstract sense. But, if you're standing on a cliff and you think whether or not you can jump to the other side, the possibility that you can fly is not going to do you any good, right? It's not going to really make it possible that you can jump to the other side. So we'll use the term realizable. That possibility might be possible in an abstract sense, but it's not going to happen. It's not realizable based on, well, whatever. You might have different conditions of what counts as something being realizable. And we could recognize that when we're talking about free will, which is usually connected with more responsibility, we're talking about possibilities that they should be realizable. So this is a real modal logic lesson, but we've got some Jimi Hendrix here to help us along the way. We'll contrast our formal notions with the Jimi Hendrix modality. But we really just want to look at 4 different types of necessity. So absolute necessity. This is absolute, tout sweet. So, in the Jimi Hendrix modality, this is all from the Jimi Hendrix song, If 6 Were 9, by the way. So he imagines, if 6 turned out to be 9, and that's okay with Jimmy. Like 6 could be 9 for Jimmy. But for most of us, 6 cannot be 9. It is not possible that 6 be 9. And it's just absolutely not possible. It's just not going to happen. Okay. Now, I'm not disparaging the Jimi Hendrix modality. I'm just saying that some of us tend to think in this sort of absolute ways with respect to certain modalities, and 6 is not 9 is sort of one of these kinds of possibilities, as opposed to, Jimmy says, if the sun refused to shine. So he imagines the possibility of the sun not shining. Now, that's not a kind of, logical or mathematical impossibility. It's just a sort of physical impossibility. Given the laws of nature, we expect the sun will shine tomorrow or the day after. And if it doesn't, we expect that that's a consequence of the laws of nature too, right? So that possibility is not absolute. It's what we'll call conditional. It's conditional upon some other facts. So, the real thesis of determinism, as I said, is that you can have any proposition that's a description about the world at a time, together with the laws of nature, and that's this logical stuff in the middle. The box is logical necessity. This is P naught, together with the laws of nature, entail any true future proposition, any one that you pick. Okay, so, but the future propositions are necessary conditional upon the past propositions and propositions about the null. It's just a necessity of the relationship between the past and the future. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then we got the logic of free will, accidental necessity, which we're going to just think of, this applies to the past, is just necessity beyond human control. because this also will apply to these experiments that we were looking at too. That's what the RP is. It's beyond our control. That's what the situation is. It's beyond our control, or at least it's beyond the right kind of control. Conscious decision-making control seems to be beyond. That's what the threat seems to be. So then our final modal lesson is closure is very important, okay? So let me give you some intuitive examples of closure from the empiricist David Hume, Scottish philosopher in the Scottish Enlightenment period. So he was famous for saying you can't derive an ought from an is. And what he meant by that, some people interpreted it as saying that science can teach you nothing about morality, but Hume himself wanted to start the moral sciences. He wanted to invent the moral sciences off of Newtonian physics, right? So he obviously thought that science could help us understand human nature and values too. In fact, he did think that. But what he didn't think was that you could take propositions that were just exclusively about, say, facts about the world in an argument and then conclude something about what you should do, something about what you should value. You know, contingent facts about the world, claims about the world aren't going to tell you what you should do. You want to yield a value claim, you got to get some value content into the conclusion or into the argument, okay? Likewise, Hume observed that mathematical demonstrations, and other people observed this too. I think Hume observed it to a certain clarity though. They start with necessary propositions. Theorem 1 is necessary. Theorem 2 is necessary. Theorem 3. Not only the truth is preserved, but the necessity is preserved. That's closure of necessity. That necessity keeps passing on. And Hume was resistant to cases of contentious necessity, like claims about the existence of something being necessary. Hume thought, well, like for anything that exists, you can imagine it not existing. So how could it necessarily exist? So he thought that existential claims, claims about existence, were contingent and could not be demonstrated in the way that mathematical claims could because they're not necessary. And he thought that if somebody passed off like a version of the cosmological argument, like Samuel Clarke tried to do, where it's claimed that God necessarily exists, Hume suspected that there would be some kind of contingent claim, right? So you wouldn't have a demonstration, you'd have what I call a demonstration, where you start with necessary claims, then you throw in a contingent claim, but that breaks the spread of necessity. And so you're not allowed to draw that necessary conclusion. You've already like spoiled the inference in a way by presenting that contingent claim. So here's the logic of free will. So this is the first observation. Physical necessity is just a conditional necessity. It's not an absolute necessity. So physical necessity, ergo determinism alone, and any kind of claims about the connections between the RP and your actions or whatever, these things alone are not going to establish free will denialism. Okay, they're just going to establish garbage in, garbage out. One thing is necessary, the other thing's going to be necessary. So you need another claim. You need a claim of accidental necessity. In my book, I call the conditional necessity of determinism a connecting thesis, and I call accidental necessity a grounding thesis. The past is necessary. It's connected to the future, so the future is necessary. So you need that accidental necessity. Another observation, accidental necessity is unlike absolute necessity. Propositions in accidental necessity go from future to present to past. They change temporal value. Well, that's normal for propositions. But in accidental necessity, they also go from contingent to necessary. They change modal value, okay? But remember modal lesson 2, closure suggests modalities are preserved. But accidental necessity requires that they change. Not clear, you can work that out. And think of like our candidate of absolute necessity. Imagine Jimmy saying 1/6 could have been 9, but it can't anymore, right? Like it was possible, that the impossible could happen one day and then the next day not. When we think about absolute necessity that way, it doesn't quite work. So what's so special about this necessity related to free will? Now, here is another contribution that I've made. This is actually my claim to fame in philosophy, is that I have a name for an objection to an argument, the consequence argument. The consequence argument is 2,000 years old. This means nobody ever thought of this objection in 2,000 years. It's about as good as you can get for somebody who does modal logic for a living. I feel pretty good about that. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. But in any event, there's a rough idea of my objection, is that accidental necessity is not enough. It's not just the necessity of the past. It's not just the fact that I can't do anything about the past now. Because if I could have done something about the past yesterday, then I'd have freedom about the future, right? So we need to go all the way back to the remote past, a time prior to the existence of human beings, to establish that accidental necessity. But that we have a remote past is clearly a contingent proposition. You're smuggling in a contingency. And so I contend that the consequence argument is a demonstration. It's not a demonstration. There's a contingent claim, a claim about the remote past that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And it can't possibly establish anything essential about determinism and lack of free will. You got to add some other conditions in order to get that kind of claim. And then last but not least, the situation is even worse, because if you agree that the argument is good, if you agree that determinism suggests that we don't have the ability to do otherwise, then you should think that determinism suggests that we have no political freedom, right? Because if we can't do otherwise, you can't vote otherwise. But isn't political freedom, at least in some societies, contingent upon being able to vote otherwise, right? So this little worry about free will spreads, and it spreads to science too, because science depends on repeatable experiments. But you don't want repeatable to just end up being the ones you happen to repeat, right? So what do we mean by repeatable if nobody can do otherwise, given the thesis of determinism? And now I want to return to the ruling argument. So this is my reconstruction of the ruling argument. And I want to thank my wife and my mother-in-law, my wife, Cindy Barnhart, who actually helped organize this talk, did the publicity for this talk, works for U of I, and her mother, Trish Nelson, used to teach. And over the holiday seasons, I was torturing them with versions of the ruling argument. But what I'm going to try to show you is from closure and accidental necessity, you can get to contingency. So my example of contingency is that Joe gets a nose ring. Suppose, for instance, that Joe has an appointment to get a nose ring, but that he hasn't decided whether to go through with it. For simplicity, imagine that the last chance for Joe to get a nose ring, in order to do that, he must leave in 5 minutes or he won't make it. We're just simplifying things. As it happens, Joe remains frozen in his deliberative wonderment, never taking a first step forward. This happens to me, where I'm supposed to make a choice and I just keep thinking about it, deliberating, and I end up, it's too late. According to our assumptions, it is false but possible that Joe gets a nose ring. This is our candidate for contingency. But the possibility that Joe gets a nose ring rests on a string of other possibilities, beginning with the possibility of Joe's first step. The possibility that Joe gets a nose ring is in fact never realized. That's contingency. The first step must be possible, since the possibility that Joe gets the nose ring requires it. That's closure. Yet it must also be impossible, since it is not taken, and thus fixed by Joe's present immobility. That's accidental necessity. The necessity of the past starts now with the present. I'm not taking that step. I'm not going to take that step. Now, we could talk about this if you want, but the main idea to realize here is, look, if that thesis about every single proposition is either true or false true, determinism tries to get you from any claim about the past to some other claim. But if you look closely on that semantic theory, you've already got the whole deck. You've got all the truths. Okay? And if you're not worried about that, why should you worry about the thesis of determinism getting you from one to the other when you've already got them? Okay. Now, if you start denying that you have all the truths, then you start complicating things. So my advice is slow down, think about it logically, and maybe we have free will after all. And that's it.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Joe can hear you. So
Yeah.
I would like to request that you go out of presenter view so people can see your
Yes.
slides full
Thank you.
screen. And then
Okay.
when people ask questions, you can leave it like that and just back through the different slides.
So now what do I get out of my what view? I
You're
think I
good
already
now.
just screwed it up. I'm good now. Oh, great. Thank you.
Hey,
All right. I
is
need
you good
advice
now?
like that, by the way. That's exactly the kind of advice I need.
So also, you can share this. You could maybe share your email or something, and you can send this PowerPoint to other people who are interested in seeing it, because some of them maybe couldn't tell the slides if they were too small.
Sure. Definitely.
Okay,
Should I do that now? Should I do it now?
No.
Oh, good.
People are gonna. You just finish on. People are gonna ask you
I'll tell you,
questions.
I'll come back in 5 minutes. I should have that taken care
No.
of. I'm just kidding.
Just stay right there, hon. Okay.
So-
Good job.
So, Joe, thank you for that
Thank
informative and engaging presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And since all possibilities are realizable, all questions are now welcome. So if
That's right.
you've got
There
a
you go.
question that you've been holding, you now have the free will to ask it.
That's it.
And just a reminder, anyone who is in one of Professor Campbell's classes at WSU, just go ahead and say hello in the chat and we'll have a record of that.
That's right.
And we've got a great audience, gosh, almost 50 people at the peak. And
Wonderful.
if we have any of our regulars would like to break the ice and go ahead and pose a question or make a response.
Anybody? Let me see if there, maybe some people might have put questions in the chats. No?
Not yet. Lots
Not
of greetings and hellos from your students so far.
Maybe I should.
So Joe,
Yeah.
maybe to get things started, could you tell us a little bit more about David Hume, which is a name that I know, but I don't know much about his life, his philosophy, and why we remember him in this context.
No, that's actually a great question. And it does kind of get back to that, the very first slide I had. Because I think Hume thinks about philosophy in a sort of broad way. And he tried to come up with what I think we call today sort of a meta philosophical account, like an account of a general account of philosophical problems and a general way to sort of look at philosophical problems, not take them each to be sort of independent in some way, but all to be sort of related in another way. And another thing about Hume, actually, and I didn't realize this until recently that I like, but so he's commonly thought of as this very strict empiricist, where he thought that the only kinds of truths were either relations of ideas, like truths that were true by definition, essentially, or matters of fact, contingent facts about the world. And so these things that seem to be necessarily true, but also seem to be, I don't have a Hume slide.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, my wife just told me to go to the Hume slide, but Hume was, I guess I could have gone to the demonstration, but I'm saying something a little bit different now, sorry. But so he's thought to think that there are only two different possible ways of expressing things, either contingent facts about the world or things that were true by definition. So maybe philosophical necessities wouldn't be possible on the Humean view. But if you look closely at what he says, the advice is not given about theories of truth, it's given about writing philosophy. He thinks that when you write philosophy, you should only try to write things that are relations of ideas, do logic, or matters of fact, do history if you're in philosophy. And I will say that if you look at my publications, they're somewhat scant, but every single one I think is a result. It's a something in logic. I try to, like, I think I have a result for the consequence argument. It's not a piece of speculation. And I do history, do work on Hume too. So I think it gives a lesson about avoiding speculative philosophy, not about what you should believe. So
we've got a couple of great questions in chat, and I'll just go ahead and read them. First from James. Can't it be necessary that I think I have free will, but in fact am mistaken? It could even be necessary that I'm wrong. The fact that of my free will may not be related contingently to my belief that I have free will. Can you help us unpack that dilemma there, or a trilemma?
The quick answer is yes. And see, this is the thing too, and it applies to free will as well as some of those other problems. So on the list of the initial problems, which I can pop up here now. Excuse me. No, I can't. Oh, here I can. Yeah.
You could just click on
So,
the number of the slide on the left side, and it should go
great.
to that in the, if you know roughly where it is in the top.
Yeah, it's all the way up here. So if you think about the reality of time, the unreality of time, so this is an argument that John McTaggart has, that time is unreal. But it's not as if he didn't think that we thought that time was real. And Zeno's paradoxes of motion, actually, they're part of paradoxes of plurality. Zeno was a monist. He thought the whole world was one. Motion was impossible because there aren't individual parts. This is not separate from the rest of the world. Okay, so it's not really moving. There's not a thing moving. So motion then must be an illusion. Time, temporal passage, must be an illusion. Free will must be an illusion if the free will denialists are right. And although I think, again, trying to prove that we have free will or prove that even the external world exists, I'm not out to do that. I don't think that that's possible. But what I think all you could do is you could find reasons for, like, why should I believe that I don't have free will? And I've looked at the arguments and the consequence argument, and I just think that they're not as good as they look, and they seem a little suspicious. They seem about as suspicious to me as the cosmological arguments seemed to Hume back in its day. And we've known now that a lot of us think it's suspicious, that argument. So,
James, does that speak to your question, or would you like to follow up by unmuting yourself and turning on your camera?
Okay, hang on a second. All
hey,
right,
James.
Hey, how you doing?
All right.
It was a nice presentation. I like seeing formalism in a talk on free will.
Thank you.
Refreshing. It is, yeah, but the fact that you find the argument suspicious, and this is a problem, a really big problem I have, is that when people have these arguments that just make sense, common sense just says yada yada. If you follow the arguments, it's obvious that yada yada. And then you do the actual empirical test, you look at the real world, and it's not yada yada. In fact,
Right.
Your arguments have led you astray. So the fact
Yes.
that smells like a cosmological argument to you, but there's empirical evidence to the contrary, is a serious problem. And it's not a problem with the argument, right?
Well, but here's the thing though, because if you look at the and this is the way that I understand it. And if you could think of a better way to understand it, then, I'd like to see what it is. But it's hard to see where the empirical stuff can fit in to the argument. Like, where are the places? And there are only two possibilities. There's one and there's two. And it can't fit into, one, because that's just the necessity of no, it does fit into one, in the sense that what it tells us is that some of this stuff is sort of beyond our control, okay? But the inference, that modal inference, the closure principle that's used here, this is not a principle of classical logic. This is a principle of a modal system that has not been proven to be complete or anything. We're just resting on our intuitions now. And if you think about it, like, I could see how some lacks of choice can transfer, but how can the fact that I wasn't around at the 2 minutes after the Big Bang transfer to now when I am around, and be the reason why I'm not raising my hand now, right? Like, I didn't have a hand back there. That didn't translate because transfer, so there's a little, it just strikes me as a little mysterious. And now that same structure is being played with respect to these empirical contentions. We got evidence that there's neural noise prior to the action. We think that it's doing the causal role. And so nothing in between is doing the work. That just seems weird. There's a lot of stuff in between doing the work too, even though there's the causal structure.
Well, we also have evidence that assertion 2 there is false. It is not necessary that the past implies the future. Because if you look at a quantum mechanical
but
event,
N doesn't stand for necessary in the logical sense here. N stands for, we don't have any control about the connection between the past and the future. Whatever it is, even if it's indeterminate, we don't have control about it, right? So we don't have any control between the connection between the RP and our action.
Cool. Thanks. I don't want to dominate the discussion, so hopefully someday we'll be able to have a beer together.
Yes.
We've got 3 more good questions in the chat.
Right.
And I have one from Maria, who asks, am I to understand that free will is interweaved with other views like incompatibilism and determinism, and doesn't exist or make sense on its own? And her follow-up is free will included in all thinking?
Wow. I think free will is included in all thinking. I think it's a sort of permanent fixture. And I think it's easy to identify in the sense that you know the difference between when you raise your own hand and when somebody raises it. And it's as clear as the difference between a hallucination and an actual experience. And this is, I think, the connection between doubts about free will and doubts about things. But now what I'm mostly concerned with is, why do people doubt free will? And this argument, the consequence argument that we're looking here, that's not my argument. It's other people's arguments that they give when they look at information, or they look at philosophy and they have doubts about free will. I see most of those arguments kind of fitting into this, this sort of broad structure. And that's why, and so do a lot of philosophers. And that's why we kind of connect up free will with whether or not determinism is true. So a lot of people, they think, for instance, that free will is necessary. Say some Christians think that free will is necessary in order to get to heaven. But they also think that God has divine foreknowledge. And so that, how can you have free will with God's divine foreknowledge? That's a real problem for some people. And so that's just one example of like that kind of conflict about a worldview that you might have, and thoughts about yourself fitting into that worldview. And historically, my dissertation was called The Logic of Freedom. In the old days, they looked at how logical laws might impact free will, like the ruling argument. And then they moved to thoughts about divine foreknowledge in medieval period. Then they moved to thoughts about causal determinism after scientific revolution. And today we worry about biology, whatever, genetics, all sorts of other things. We have contemporary worries about free will. My belief is really all these worries are the same, and some of the worries are a little confused. But by no means do I think all of them are confused. There are good reasons for thinking that we don't have it. I just haven't met a convincing argument yet, is all. Does that
Joe,
answer your question,
Nancy
Maria?
Cheney has
Oh,
an observation
Mayor.
and a question. Nancy says, as you describe the logic of free will, I found myself extending that logic to recent examples of political action and inaction, and arguments that life and death policies are ignored because they are outside of jurisdictional control or too complex to contemplate, or that existential challenges like climate change are secondary to small legal loopholes. She's asking is this outside the scope of your presentation, or would you care to apply that logic of free will to political action and inaction?
Well, no, I would care to, and I do, and people laugh because I'm like interested in logic and metaphysics, but my whole reason for getting interested in philosophy is political. It's all political, and I think underlying just our doubts about free will are essentially sort of political stories about certain books that were allowed to pass through history of Western civilization and certain books that were not allowed to pass through the history of Western civilization and the history that we're sort of left with there. But I'll go even further. So I'm working on this paper on Gandhi now. So he has this concept of freedom, and he uses the same term, and I'm sorry, I can't remember it, but the same term for both political freedom and individual freedom. And when he talks about individual freedom, he's really talking about free will. And he too is concerned with, intimately, personally concerned with the problem of free will and determinism, because he was a Hindu and he believed in karma, which is a kind of determinism. So it was a real life problem for him. And he was a compatibilist. But the key to political freedom for him is individual freedom. They're the same kind of thing. And the key to Indian freedom was not getting Indians in control of their country, but getting them to have personal freedom. And if all the individuals, I think Gandhi truly believed this, and I actually truly believe this too, if all of the individuals had personal freedom, there would be political freedom. There wouldn't be any political hardships if that was attainable. And so personal freedom is a kind of enlightenment or something for him. But it's also a concept of freedom. And the interesting thing is it's very similar to Spinoza's view of freedom. But Spinoza calls his view of freedom blessedness and distinguishes it from free will, which almost by definition kind of is opposed to physical necessity for Spinoza. So it gets a little complicated. I mean, there are all these different views. I see Spinoza, I see, and this is the point I wanted to make about Hume too, to leave you with. This is what Hume has taught me. We get caught up in philosophy as looking at them as qualitative debates, true or false. You've got to be right about free will. I've got to be wrong about it. One of us just has the view and it's right or wrong. Hume teaches you to think about them as quantitative differences, okay? So Spinoza, who rejected free will, accepted a kind of freedom, bought into something, the same kind of freedom that Gandhi accepted, and he called it free will, essentially, okay? So they might have, when you look at them in opposition, they seem like they have different views. One's a free will denialist and the other is a compatibilist. But in fact, their views are very similar. I would say Dirk Perreboom's view is very similar to my own view. I just choose to characterize it in different ways. And so you wonder what really is the debate there in the first place. But
I know that some of our WSU students need to leave for another class, but Joe, if you're willing to go for a couple more minutes, We have a
Sure.
question from
I can't
Michael.
get out of my driveway.
Yeah. We have a question from Michael in Providence, Rhode Island, watching us from across the country. And he asks, are you
Nice.
suggesting that your modal logic argument requires consciousness as an additional modality, or is this just a general requirement for free will? And in parentheses, he writes, my thinking, if your argument succeeds without it, then what happens? So do we need to have consciousness as an additional modality?
I don't think so. Again, because I think that actually I have a ton of thoughts about this too. Because I mean, for me, I'm trying to think about what role consciousness plays in freedom, because I feel like I do a lot of things that I would classify as being free, and I'm not sure that consciousness plays a role. Like I think about driving, and I also think that consciousness comes in degrees too. So you're driving every once in a while and you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I wasn't paying attention. But if you weren't paying attention, you would have driven off the road, right? So you were paying attention on some level, not kind of paying attention. Were you not free or less free because of the difference in consciousness? I have a hard time seeing how consciousness entered into the picture, and I only enter it into because they need it to get you from the results in neuroscience in order to make claims about free will and moral responsibility. You've got to put in some additional requirement. Up to usness or the ability to do otherwise doesn't translate very well in terms of like some kind of scientific test. So, but you can measure states of conscious awareness by reports, and you can measure brain activity in certain ways. So the consciousness fits into the argument. But the way that it fits into the argument is, and think of it this way, here's what the person that accepts this consequence argument is trying to tell you. You could take two people, they both rob a store, okay? And it was a determined event that they robbed the store. It was determined from the time that they were born. So there's an explanation of the robbery from the time that they were born. One of them could have grown up in a situation of poverty, and the other one could have been Donald Trump, right? Okay. Are you telling me that, from the facts, you get all the explanations that you need in order to make determinations about the quality of the individual? You just bypass the whole individual there. So I just don't see that that lack of control kind of bypassing in that way. There's a lot of control during the course of a person's lifetime that gets missed out if you think that determinism tells the explanatory story in the way that is alleged in this argument.
So we'll go to a concluding question from Tom, who circles back to a point in your talk. He asks, could you describe the conditional versus unconditional ability to do otherwise and relate it to your talk? And by follow-up, he asks, could you have gotten a nose ring in the actual situation in which you were paralyzed by doubt?
Oh, yeah, right. No, and that's a good, these are good questions. I mean, I don't, so here's what I think. I think that if determinism is true, I think I have this ability to do otherwise. I don't really have an analysis. Here's what I have is I have like a little mini argument, is because what we really want to distinguish when we tell these stories is the difference between people with compulsive behavior and people without compulsive behavior. So, I wash my hands, Susie washes her hands, Susie has compulsive hand washing disorder. The lesson we're supposed to learn from the consequence argument is that to tell whether or not somebody had control, the kind of control that's relevant to the phrase could have done otherwise, you just like zoom back time, like just prior to, deciding whether you wash your hands or not, and see how the behavior is. But if my hands are dirty, I'm going to wash my hands every single time. If you hold fixed the past and the laws of nature, I'm going to wash my hands. Just like Susie, who has the compulsive hand washing disorder. I think really, if you want to tell the difference, what you need to do is vary the situations. It's the fact that I don't always wash my hands in every single situation, whether they're dirty or not, that gives me the freedom that Susie lacks in the compulsive disorder. And so I just don't think that, I think that we have the ability to do otherwise. I don't have an analysis. I don't see how it has anything to do with determinism, I guess.
On that note, we're well past our time, and I think we'll wrap up. So thank you, everyone, for your
Well, I enjoyed this,
participation.
and thank you all. I have Maria Gundy. I could see a friend of mine from high school here, Jim Schlater, a former student of mine. So this is exciting. Thank you.
Well, before we let you go, Joe, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to turn on their cameras and give you a virtual round of applause, or just put up the hand in chat. And would be great to see more faces, and always good to have participation from our audience. I think that's one of the things that makes this colloquium so distinctive, is that the interdisciplinary nature comes from the feedback and questions and comments from the audience. So,
all right.
And
Tom Clark too, I see there.
So next week, Tuesday, the 23rd, at this time slot, 12:30 p.m., we'll have a preview of the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival, and a look behind the scenes at organizing a virtual jazz festival. So hope you'll join us for that. And all of the WSU folks are always welcome to join us. We have 2 more WSU faculty members from College of Arts and Sciences scheduled later this semester. So it's a true cross-border partnership that Malcolm Renfrew would have been proud of. So thanks, everyone. Be safe out there, stay warm, and good luck